The moment I saw Lord Cassius's hand close around Prince Torin's arm, I was already moving. I did not think about rank or protocol or the dozen witnesses close enough to watch a guard lay hands on the queen consort's son in the middle of a boundary dispute that had already grown louder than any of us liked. I thought only that I was somehow too late for whatever was about to happen, and that thought alone had my boots crossing the meadow grass before my mind had caught up with the rest of me. My name is Sergeant Corin Ashby, and for 4 years I have stood the personal rotation over Prince Torin of Eldermoor, eldest of the young princes, 11 years old that autumn, a boy who collected maps the way his younger brother collected snails, and who had never once, in 4 years, given me a genuine fright by wandering somewhere he shouldn't. That was, I want to be honest, part of why what happened at the boundary meadow rattled me as badly as it did. I had learned to trust Torin's stillness the way another guard might have learned to trust a younger child's noise. I always knew, more or less, where a quiet, careful boy would be, and I had let that certainty make me slower than I should have been on the one afternoon it mattered most. This is the story of that afternoon, of a heated argument between two men who never raised a hand to anyone, of a horse that very nearly did what neither of them would, and of the 3 or 4 seconds in which I mistook the one man standing close enough to save my prince for a threat to him. I have turned it over more times than I can count in the months since, and I have come to believe it is worth setting down properly, not because it ended badly, for it did not, but because of how close I came to making it worse, and because of what it taught me, far too late in my career to be comfortable admitting it, about the difference between a man's reputation and the truth of him. To understand why I nearly put my hand on a peer of the realm in front of half the household, you first have to understand what I already believed about Lord Cassius before that afternoon, and where that belief had come from. It did not arrive out of nothing. Very little in this household ever does. I had been posted to Prince Torin in the spring of my 4th year in the King's Guard, a season after a transfer from the outer wall rotation that most of the older sergeants considered a promotion, and I considered, privately, something closer to a trial by close observation. Guarding a wall, you watch for what comes at it. Guarding a child, you watch the child, every mood, every habit, every small shift in the way he carries himself, because the wall does not wander off after something that has caught its interest, and an 11-year-old prince with a passion for old boundary maps very much can. Torin, in the years I had known him, was the least troublesome charge any guard in this household could hope to draw, and I want to say plainly that this made him no easier to protect, only differently difficult. He did not run. He did not climb. He did not vanish into hedge mazes or clock towers the way I gathered his younger brother Bram had built something of a household legend out of doing. Torin walked where he walked with a deliberate, watchful gait that made him look, at 11, rather older than he was, the kind of boy who consulted a guard on a point of protocol, the way another child might ask permission to eat a second sweet, gravely, as though the answer genuinely mattered to him. He loved maps with a devotion that struck most of the household as a faintly eccentric hobby for a future king, and struck me, who had watched him at it for years, as something closer to a discipline. He kept a growing collection of hand-copied boundary charts in a chest in his room, annotated in his own careful, improving hand, and he could tell you, if you asked and had the patience to hear the full answer, the precise history of every stone that marked the border between Eldermoor and its 3 neighboring holdings, including several disputes that had been settled, resettled, and quietly re-argued for the better part of 2 centuries. He was not, I should say, a solemn child in the way that description might suggest. He teased his younger sister Malin mercilessly about her puppet shows, in the fond, deadpan way older brothers do, and he had a genuine and often overlooked gift for making his youngest brother Bram laugh until he hiccuped, usually by way of some absurdly detailed fact about a boundary dispute rendered, for Bram's benefit, as though it were the plot of an adventure story. King Alaric, who had a soldier's practical mind and little patience for idle scholarship, had nonetheless taken over the years to asking Torin's opinion on minor questions of estate management, with a seriousness that plainly delighted the boy more than any toy or outing could have. And I had watched more than one dry council afternoon light considerably when the king turned to his eldest grandson and asked him with evident sincerity what he made of a particular boundary claim. It was, I came to understand, watching them together, one of the quieter kindnesses of that household, that a boy's unusual passion was treated, by nearly everyone in it, as a strength worth cultivating rather than an oddity to be gently corrected out of him. I should explain, before I go any further, why my own instincts ran as hot and as fast as they did on the morning everything happened, because it did not begin with Lord Cassius at all. It began 3 years earlier, in my first season on the outer wall rotation, long before I had ever been trusted with a prince's safety. I had been posted, that autumn, to the wide public terrace below the old East Gate, where visitors were permitted to gather during the ordinary hours to watch the changing of the household guard, a post that asked very little of a young guard beyond patience and a steady eye on a generally well-behaved crowd. On the afternoon I still think of most, a woman near the front of that crowd had let go of her small son's hand for no longer than it takes to answer a question, and the boy, delighted by the gleam of a ceremonial pike catching the sun, had darted forward, straight toward the working edge of the formation, directly into the path of a full guard company completing a turn in close order, boots and blades moving in the exact, practiced unison that leaves no room in it for an unexpected child. I reached him. I want to say that plainly, the same way I have wanted it understood at every point in this account where a child's safety hung on very little. I reached him in time, caught him by the back of his collar, and swung him clear with 2 full strides to spare, and he walked away from that terrace with nothing worse than a fright and a scolding from his mother that he almost certainly still remembers better than I do. But for the length of those 2 strides, sprinting flat out across open stone with my whole career, and every certainty I had ever held about my own competence riding on whether my legs were fast enough, I did not know that would be true. I believed, for perhaps 3 full seconds, that I was about to watch a small boy broken under a company of my own comrades' boots, close enough that I would carry the sound of it for the rest of my life, and too far to do a single thing to stop it. Nothing happened to him. Something happened to me, all the same in those 3 seconds that never fully left. I have not since that afternoon been able to watch a child drift anywhere near a moving hazard, a horse, a stair, an open water, a company of guards in close formation, without my whole body going taut and forward before my mind has finished deciding whether the danger is real. My training officer at the time, a blunt, practical woman named Captain Iseult Grave, called it, in the dry way senior officers have of turning a young guard's fright into a line worth keeping on his record, the fastest reflex I've clocked on this wall in a decade, and the useful kind of fast, not the reckless kind, so long as he learns to check it the instant the danger's past. She put in the request herself that saw me moved, 2 seasons later, from the outer wall to the close personal rotation, on the theory, which I have since had a great deal of cause to be grateful for, that a guard who moved that fast toward a stranger's child would move faster still toward one he had sworn his whole service to. I set this down because it belongs at the center of everything that follows, every bit as much as what I believed, wrongly, about Lord Cassius. My hand came up in that boundary meadow, 3 years and a great many quiet, uneventful seasons after that terrace, not because of anything Cassius himself had done to earn my suspicion in that instant, but because some part of me had never fully stopped being the young guard on the East Terrace, watching a company of boots close on a boy he was not yet fast enough to save. That old reflex is, I have come to believe, the truest reason I misjudged what I saw at the picket line as badly, and as quickly as I did, not 4 years of a cold man's reputation alone, though that reputation did its share of the damage, but 3 seconds on a terrace years before either of them had ever met, still living somewhere under my ribs, waiting for the next fast, violent-looking motion to prove it right. I say nearly everyone, deliberately, because that one qualification sat at the center of everything I believed about Lord Cassius for 2 long years afterward, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the exact shape of the wrong I eventually had to unlearn. It was this last passion, more than anything else, that put him in the Boundary Meadow on the afternoon everything happened, and I will come to that. But first, because it matters to everything that follows, I have to set down honestly what I believed, wrongly, about Lord Cassius, and how thin the evidence for it truly was once I finally made myself look at it plainly. Lord Cassius was queen consort Morwenna's son from a marriage that had ended by widowhood well before she married King Alaric. I had known him, by sight and by reputation, for the whole of my posting to Torin, and what I knew of him in those first years could be summed up, unflatteringly, in a single word the guardroom used often and without much thought for its fairness: cold. He was a tall man, composed to the point of stillness, dark-haired with an early gray threading at the temples, and he managed several of the crown's rural estates with a thoroughness nobody in the household disputed, and a manner almost nobody in the household warmed to. He did not linger at the children's table. He did not join the informal games that sprang up on long summer evenings on the south lawn. He attended what duty required and excused himself, with unfailing courtesy from what it did not, and I had watched him do this often enough over 4 years to have built out of it a settled, comfortable, and I would eventually learn badly mistaken picture of the man. The specific incidents that built that picture are worth setting down, because without them nothing that follows will make proper sense, and because I want to be honest about how little they actually amounted to, and how certain I was of my reading of them regardless. The first was in Torin's 9th year, at a formal reception for a visiting delegation of river merchants, when the boy, already deep in his fascination with old charts, even then, had approached Lord Cassius during a lull in the receiving line to ask, with the earnest gravity that was entirely his own, whether it was true that the western estates kept records of the old river crossing tolls going back 3 centuries, and whether he might one day be permitted to see them. Cassius had looked down at him for a moment with an expression I read, at the time, as simple irritation at being troubled by a child's question in the middle of formal business, and said, "Not today. This is not the place," in a voice pitched low but flat enough to carry the full weight of a closed door. Torin, who did not often show disappointment plainly, had nonetheless gone a shade quieter for the rest of that evening, and I remembered it, filing it away under a heading I had already, by then, begun keeping in my mind without quite admitting to myself that I was keeping it. The second came a year later, during a formal survey of the royal stable's breeding stock, when Torin, eager, as he was about most things involving measurement and record-keeping, had asked whether he might be permitted to help mark the new foal's registry, a task Cassius was overseeing that season on the king's behalf. Cassius had said no briefly, without particular unkindness but without softening it either, and had turned back to his ledger before Torin had fully finished asking, and I had watched the boy stand there a moment working out that the conversation had ended, and walk off toward the paddock rail to watch instead, quiet in the particular way careful children are quiet when they have been told, however gently, that they are in the way. The third I witnessed myself at closer range than either of the others, and it is the one that decided me, more than the 2 before it, because it came wrapped in a moment I had genuinely expected to go differently. It was an evening the following spring, a family dinner held later than usual to accommodate a delayed council session, the children permitted to stay at table past their ordinary hour, and Torin, 12 by then, buoyed by the informality of the evening, had brought one of his hand-copied boundary charts to the table and begun, with careful, earnest thoroughness, explaining to Lord Cassius, seated beside him that night by the ordinary shuffle of place cards. Exactly why he believed a particular stretch of the old western border had been mismarked 2 generations ago. Cassius had listened, or appeared to, for perhaps 2 minutes, his face giving away nothing, and then said, "That is a matter for the crown surveyors, not for a boy's spare hour," and set the chart gently but firmly to one side, and returned his attention to the king, who had asked him something about grain tariffs. Torin had gone very still, the particular stillness he wore when he was working hard not to show he had been stung, folded the chart back into its leather case without another word, and did not bring it to the table again for the rest of that year. I remember thinking, watching that exchange from my post along the wall, there is a man who has no patience for what this boy loves, and I do not understand why a household with 3 children in it tolerates so little warmth from a man who lives inside it. I want to be honest, setting this down now, about what I did not do in the years that followed those 3 small moments. I did not ask anyone why Lord Cassius held himself the way he did. I did not wonder whether a man raised in circumstances I knew almost nothing about might simply lack the easy vocabulary for warmth that came naturally to the rest of the household. I took 3 brief, ungenerous moments, none of them cruel, none of them even particularly cold by the ordinary standards of half the courtiers I had guarded over the years, and I built out of them a settled portrait of a man who did not care to be troubled by a child's enthusiasms, and having built it, I never once tested it against anything Cassius did when I was not already looking for evidence to confirm it. That is the failing at the center of this account, and it was mine long before it belonged to anyone else. By the autumn the boundary survey came due, a decennial custom between Eldermoor and the neighboring Duchy of Rosemont, in which representatives of both households met at the old marker meadow along the river to formally re-walk and remark the ancient stones between them, a tradition older than either the current king or the current duke, and taken, by both sides, with a seriousness that the casual observer might have found faintly comic in an age of properly surveyed maps and settled treaties. Lord Cassius had settled in my private accounting into a fixed and unflattering shape, competent, composed, closed off particularly from the one boy in the household, whose entire heart lived in exactly the kind of careful, patient record-keeping Cassius handled every day for the crown's own estates, and never once thought, apparently, to share with him. I did not yet know how wrong I was. I did not yet know how good a reason I was about to be given to find out. The boundary survey that year fell on a bright, cool day in early autumn, the kind of morning that carries just enough of a bite to remind you the season is turning, with a sky scrubbed pale and clean over the river meadow that marked the old line between Eldermoor and Rosemont. It was, by long tradition, as much a social occasion as a legal one. The crown surveyors and their Rosemont counterparts would walk the boundary stones one by one, comparing the current markers against the old charter descriptions, while the households of both duchies gathered at a respectful distance under a scatter of pavilion tents, treating the whole slow, careful business as an excuse for a fine autumn outing. Duke Edmund and Duchess Sylvie of Rosemont had come themselves that year, along with a modest retinue, and King Alaric had sent Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara to receive them formally, with Torin permitted to attend at his own considerable and repeated request, on the condition, issued by his mother with the particular firmness she reserved for genuine hazards rather than ordinary mischief, that he stay well back from the working line and well within sight of his guard. I want to be honest that I had looked forward to that condition holding without much difficulty. Torin was not, by nature, a boy who tested the edges of a rule once it had been given to him plainly. I had spent 4 years learning to trust that about him, and it is precisely that trust, earned honestly over 4 good years, that I believe made me slower than I should have been on the one afternoon it did not hold quite the way I expected. I could not have known, walking out to the boundary meadow that morning with Torin at my side and his satchel of hand-copied charts under his arm, that by the time the sun reached its highest point over the river, I would have my hand half raised against Lord Cassius, certain for 3 full seconds that I was watching him hurt the boy I had sworn 4 years of my life to protect. But before I set down what happened at the meadow, I want to explain properly how I came, over the 2 years before it, to change my mind about the man I nearly moved against. Because without that turning, I do not believe I would have understood what I was seeing quickly enough to matter, and the whole of this account would be a different and far less honest one. It began, as so many corrections to a settled opinion do, with something I overheard rather than something I was told outright. I had asked, one wet evening the winter after that dinner-table dismissal, half out of simple curiosity and half out of a guard's habit of wanting to understand anyone who spent regular time near his charge, whether Sergeant Major Ossian Reeve, who had guarded this household for the better part of 25 years, and had the kind of unhurried, well-worn patience that comes only from having watched several generations of a family grow up and grow older, remembered Lord Cassius's father. Reeve had set down the strap of harness leather he was mending, which was, for Reeve, roughly the equivalent of another man clearing his throat and pulling up a chair. "Lord Havard," he said, "for your time and very nearly before mine as well, I was a young guard when he died, no older than you are now. He held the Western Estates, back when the Queen Consort was simply Lady Morwenna, and not yet married into this house at all. Fine horseman, finer soldier in his younger years, before an old injury took him off active service and put him behind a desk he never once forgave for the change." Reeve turned the harness strap over in his hands, considering it without really seeing it. "And the most unbending man I ever stood post near in 25 years of standing post near unbending men, Ashby, which in this line of work is saying a very great deal." "Unbending how?" I said. "There's a story the old guards used to tell, from the household before it was folded into this one, that the boy Cassius, 6 or 7 at the time, fell hard from a pony during a lesson, split his lip open on the paddock rail, and his father would not let him be carried back to the house. Made him walk the whole distance himself, on his own 2 feet, blood on his collar and all, and told him a man does not need carrying for a split lip, and the sooner he learned that, the fewer split lips he'd earned feeling sorry for himself over the ones he'd already had." Reeve looked up at me. "I don't know that every detail of that story is exactly true. Stories like that pick up a bit more color with every guardroom they pass through, same as any other. But I knew Lord Havard myself later, when I was posted near enough to see him at close range for the better part of a year, and I'll tell you this much is certainly true. I never once saw that man embrace his son. I saw him shake the boy's hand on his 10th birthday, like he was congratulating a junior officer on a commission. I saw him correct the boy's posture at table with the flat of 2 fingers between the shoulder blades, in front of guests, more times than I care to count. I never once heard him praise anything the boy made or built or wrote, however carefully done. And I do not say that lightly, because I liked Lord Havard well enough. In the narrow way you can like a man for his discipline without ever wanting to live a day inside his house. "He died when Cassius was young," I said. "It was not quite a question. 13, thereabouts. Sudden trouble with his heart, one ordinary morning, no warning to prepare a boy for what he was about to lose. I stood the honor guard at that funeral, Ashby. I remember Cassius did not cry, not once, through a 2-hour service in front of half the nobility of 3 counties, and I remember the old dowagers murmuring afterward what a credit he was to his father's memory, what remarkable composure in a boy so young, and I remember thinking, even then, young as I was myself, that it was not composure I was looking at. It was a boy who had been taught, thoroughly and completely, over 13 years, that there was no room in that household for anything else." Reeve picked the harness back up, though he did not resume the mending. "Lady Morwenna remarried some years after, a fine match by every account, and King Alaric is not, whatever else you might say of him, anything like Lord Havard. But I don't imagine 13 years unlearns itself in a season, or a decade, And I've watched that man grow up in this household long enough to say this with some confidence. He does not withhold himself from these children because he lacks the warmth. He withholds it because somewhere very early on, he was taught, in the clearest terms a father can teach a son, that showing it costs you 2 fingers between the shoulder blades in front of company. A man does not forget a lesson like that. He only learns, very young, exactly how much of an audience he can bear to risk it in front of. I sat with that a long while, the mending forgotten between us. Then why does he shut Torin out the way he does? I said slowly. The boy only wants to talk maps and old charters. There's no audience in it worth guarding against. It's a dinner table, or a stable ledger, or a receiving line. Hardly the sort of thing to risk his composure over. Reeve gave me the smallest and driest of smiles. That, he said, is the part I can't tell you because it isn't mine to know. But I'd wager it's simpler than you're making it, and I'd wager, too, that you haven't been watching him nearly as closely as you think you have, if all you've seen in 2 years is 3 doors closing. A man doesn't build a wall that thick over nothing, Ashby. He builds it because something on the other side of it matters enough to guard. He picked the leather back up in earnest this time, done with the conversation. My honest opinion, for what it's worth after 25 years of watching this family at 3 paces remove, I think Lord Cassius minds a great deal more than this household gives him credit for minding, and I think the reason nobody's noticed is that he spent his whole life making very sure of it. I did not sleep especially well that night, turning it over, not because it disturbed me exactly, but because it rearranged something I had built out of what I had believed was solid material, and a man does not much enjoy discovering, several years into a career built on careful observation, that his observation had been careful about entirely the wrong things. I began watching Cassius differently after that conversation, not for evidence to confirm what I already believed, which had been my habit for 2 quiet years, but for what felt like the first time, actually looking, the way I would have looked at a stranger I was honestly trying to understand rather than a man I had already finished judging. What I found, once I started looking properly, embarrassed me somewhat, because a good deal of it had been there in plain sight the whole time, filed by me under the wrong heading. I noticed that Cassius never once forgot the name of a tenant family on the western estates, nor the particulars of whatever trouble had brought them to his attention. A bad harvest, an ailing parent, a roof gone soft with rot, and that he asked after all of it on his rounds, with a specificity that suggested he had genuinely been listening the previous time the subject came up rather than performing the courtesy of remembering. I noticed that when a young stable hand made a costly error that autumn with one of the survey party's carriage horses, an error that by ordinary household custom should have cost the boy his post, it was Cassius who quietly covered the animal's care out of his own purse and said nothing of it to anyone, a fact I learned only because Reeve happened to know the stable master well enough to have heard it firsthand, months later, in passing. I noticed that Cassius attended, without fail, every meeting concerning the welfare of tenants on the estates he managed, repairs to failing cottages, disputes over grazing rights. A lean winter that he personally ensured did not put a single family under his charge to bed hungry, and that he did every bit of it without ceremony, without seeking the king's notice or the household's thanks. In the plain, unglamorous manner of a man discharging an obligation, he took entirely seriously, and expected no credit whatsoever for discharging. None of it looked, on the surface, anything like warmth toward a child. It looked, if you were watching the way I had watched for 2 years, like duty, competent, thorough, closed-off duty, filed under the same old heading. But once Reeve's story had cracked the ledger open, I began to see the shape underneath it, the way you see the outline of an old buried wall once someone points out the thin, telling pattern of the grass growing over it. I began to wonder that winter what it would take to see the same warmth turned, even once, toward the boy in my own charge. Not out of any deliberate test I set for Cassius, but because I found, once I had begun looking properly at the man, that I wanted very much to be wrong about him. I did not have to wait as long as I expected. It happened, as these small turning points so often seem to, on an ordinary afternoon that gave no advance sign of mattering. Torin had taken to spending his free hours that spring in the old estate archive, a long, dusk-quiet room in the northern wing, where 2 centuries of Eldermoor's boundary records were kept in tall cabinets nobody, but the crown surveyors and the household stewards had much occasion to open, and I had taken to standing my post just inside the door, more out of habit than any real concern. Since there was little in that room, a boy could come to harm on beyond a paper cut, and a great deal of dust on his sleeves. I was standing there on a gray, quiet afternoon in early spring, half listening to the scratch of Torin's pen as he copied some old parish boundary onto a fresh sheet, when the door opened behind me and Lord Cassius came in, a ledger of his own under one arm, clearly on some ordinary errand of his own that had nothing to do with the boy at the long table. He stopped when he saw Torin there. I watched him stop, watched something cross his face that I could not immediately name, and braced myself, out of 2 years' habit, for the flat, courteous dismissal I had come to expect whenever Torin's enthusiasms met Cassius's composure in the same room. It did not come. "You are copying the old Fenmark parish line," Cassius said instead, coming to stand at the far end of the table, close enough to see the page but not so close as to loom over it. It was not a question. "From the 1690 survey, unless I am mistaken." Torin looked up, startled into stillness the way he always was when an adult showed genuine interest in his charts rather than polite tolerance of them. "The 1687 survey," he said. "There's a difference of nearly 40 yards in the western section between it and the one from 1690. I think the 1691 is wrong. The surveyor's own notes say the river had flooded twice that spring, and I don't think he ever actually walked the line. I think he copied the old figures and adjusted them by guesswork." I watched Cassius set his own ledger down on the table, unhurried, and pull out the chair across from Torin, and sit. "Show me," he said. What followed, over the better part of an hour, was nothing I would have predicted from 2 years of careful, mistaken watching. Cassius took Torin's page apart line by line, not to correct it, though he did, gently, point out 2 places where the boy's arithmetic had gone astray, but to test it, to press him on his reasoning the way I imagine a crown surveyor might press a promising apprentice, asking him why he trusted one set of notes over another, what evidence beyond the flooding he could point to, whether he had considered that the 1690 surveyor might have had access to an even older record that had since been lost. Torin answered every question with a seriousness that lit his whole face in a way I had rarely seen it lit, and Cassius, for his part, showed none of the flat closed-door courtesy I had watched him deploy at that dinner table 2 years before. He listened. He argued a point, and then, twice, conceded it with visible and genuine interest when Torin's reasoning held up better than his own initial skepticism. "You have a surveyor's mind," Cassius said finally, sitting back, studying the boy across the table with an expression I did not, at the time, have the vocabulary to name, though I would come to recognize it later as something very close to pride. "That is not a common thing in a boy your age, and it is a rarer thing still in a boy who will one day be expected to spend most of his hours on matters considerably less exact than an old parish line. I would encourage you to keep at it for as long as anyone lets you." "Nobody minds mostly," Torin said, with the particular careful neutrality of a boy who had learned, without quite admitting it to himself, that some people minded rather more than they said. "Except sometimes it isn't the right time, or the right place." Something crossed Cassius's face at that. I was close enough for once to see it plainly, and I am as certain now as I was that afternoon that it was recognition, quick and unhappy, of his own earlier self reflected back at him through a boy too honest to soften the observation. "No," he said, after a moment quieter. "I imagine it is not sometimes. I owe you an apology for at least 2 of those times if I am remembering rightly, and I find, now that I am sitting here with you, that I am somewhat at a loss to explain to myself why I let a receiving line and a dinner table matter as much as they did." He did not elaborate further, and Torin, with the particular grace children sometimes show toward an adult's unfinished sentence, did not press him to. "I still have the chart," Torin offered instead, "the one about the western border from the dinner. I never finished explaining it." "Then I hope you will finish explaining it to me now," Cassius said, "properly, and at whatever length the subject requires, since I understand from the surveyor's own records that I have been wrong about that stretch of border myself for the better part of a decade, and I find I would rather be corrected by someone who has actually done the reading." I stood at that door for the better part of another hour, watching a man I had spent 2 years filing under a single unkind heading listen, with total and evident sincerity, to an 11-year-old boy's theory about a 40-year-old surveying error. And I understood, standing there, that I had been wrong about something a great deal larger than 3 small moments at a receiving line, a paddock rail, and a dinner table. I did not yet understand how wrong, or how much further I still had to travel before I would trust that understanding completely. But it was, I think now, the true beginning of it. I want to be honest that this beginning did not hold as steadily as I expected it to. 3 weeks later, I passed Lord Cassius in the long gallery on my way to the guardroom, Torin at my side on his way to a lesson, and the boy, emboldened, I think, by the afternoon in the archive, and eager in the particular way children are eager once they believe a door has genuinely opened to them, stopped and asked, brightly, whether Lord Cassius might come with them to see the new survey markers the crown surveyors had just set along the eastern boundary. Since he had heard there was some dispute about the placement and thought Cassius, of anyone in the household, would find it interesting. Cassius did not slow his stride. He gave the boy the smallest possible incline of his head, courteous and entirely distant, the same nod I had watched him give footmen who held doors for him, and said, "I have a council matter that wants my attention this afternoon, Torin. Another time, perhaps," and continued past us down the gallery without breaking stride, gone around the corner before either of us had fully absorbed the flatness of it. I watched Torin's face do the small, careful thing it did when he was working not to show he had been stung, and felt, on his behalf and my own, a sharp and genuinely embarrassing disappointment, as though the man in the archive had been some other Cassius entirely, borrowed for an hour and returned promptly to storage, once the audience of one had thinned to nothing worth the risk. There, asterisk, said the old ledger in my head, the one I had come so close to closing for good. You saw what you wanted to see once in a quiet room with no one else watching. He is exactly what you always believed he was, and the archive was simply an afternoon when it cost him nothing to be otherwise. I want to be honest that this false dawn, I did not have the phrase for it then, but it is the only one that fits what happened to my judgment over the following weeks, did more damage to my reading of the man than 2 years of small unkindnesses had managed on their own, because it let me file the whole afternoon away as an aberration rather than a revelation, and it very nearly stopped me watching Cassius at all, in the close, honest way I had only just begun to watch him. It did not help that the guardroom, when I let slip a sanitized version of the archive afternoon over cards one evening, greeted it with precisely the skepticism I had half expected, and if I am honest, half wanted, because it let me off the hook of holding 2 contradictory ideas about a man in my head at once. Cassius, sitting an hour with the boy over an old chart, said a younger guard named Petrie, laughing into his cup. Sure it wasn't the king's brandy talking, Ashby. I was standing at the door the whole while, stone sober, I said, more sharply than the joke deserved, and Reeve, who had said little through the exchange, looked at me over the rim of his own cup with the particular unreadable patience of a man who has watched a great many younger guards work through a great many misjudgments, and prefers to let them arrive at their own conclusions rather than hurry them there. Man can sit an hour with a boy over a chart and still brush him off in a gallery a fortnight later, Petrie said, not unkindly, more in the spirit of an argument enjoyed than a point pressed hard. Doesn't make him warm. Makes him decent when it costs him nothing, and closed when it doesn't. I did not have an answer for that then, because it matched too closely something I had already half decided myself, and I let the matter drop, and told myself it was settled, and went back mostly to watching Torin the way I always had rather than watching Cassius at all, which meant that when the truth of the man revealed itself again, a season later, I very nearly missed it entirely, because I was no longer looking for it. It was Torin himself in the end, who put it back in front of me, without meaning to, and without knowing he was doing it. He came to me one evening that summer, uncharacteristically subdued for a boy who rarely let his moods show, and told me, in the careful, roundabout way children tell you a thing they are not quite sure they ought to mention, that a visiting young lord, the son of a minor house, in Harrogate for a fortnight with his family, had mocked him at the stable yard that afternoon in front of several other boys, calling his charts a clerk's hobby, and asking, with the particular cruelty boys that age can manage without ever quite meaning to be cruel, whether a future king intended to spend his reign counting fence posts instead of leading armies. I had not been present for it. I had been relieved for the hour by another guard while Torin took his riding lesson, and I felt the familiar cold drop of having failed to be where I was needed, until Torin, watching my face, added, almost as an afterthought, that it hadn't mattered in the end, because Lord Cassius had been walking past the stable yard at the time. He didn't shout at him or anything, Torin said, working it out aloud as he told it, the way children often do. He just stopped and looked at the boy Aldrich. His name was for quite a long time, long enough that Aldrich went red and stopped laughing. And then he said that a fence post correctly placed had settled more wars in this kingdom's history than any army had, and that he would be glad to introduce Aldrich to the surveyor who redrew the entire southern boundary after the last one, if Aldrich cared to learn what real work looked like, since it seemed a shame for a guest of this household to leave it thinking a clerk's hobby was beneath him. And then he told Aldrich's own father about it, quietly, later, not to get him in trouble exactly, but I don't know. So it would be understood, I think, that it mattered. I sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way I had turned over Reeve's story of the split lip and the fence rail, the way I had turned over that hour in the archive before I let a single flat word in a gallery undo it. I understood, hearing it, that I had let one closed door in 3 weeks erase an hour of open ones, and that I had done it not because the evidence pointed that way, but because it was easier. It had always been easier with Cassius to believe the worst and call it caution. I did not make that mistake again, not fully, though I want to be honest that some part of the old wariness lingered in me even after that. The way a stone worked into a boot does not always fall out simply because you have noticed it there. I began watching Cassius properly again, and this time I did not let a single cool moment undo what I found, because I had learned, finally, that the coolness and the warmth were not two different men taking turns, but the same man, guarding the warmth carefully in every room he did not trust, and setting it down freely in the rare ones he did. The clearest proof of it came that same year, in early summer, when Cassius made a request of Crown Prince Rowan that struck the whole household, myself included, as entirely out of character for the man I still half believed I understood. That Torin be permitted to accompany him for 3 days to the western estates, to observe, and if he showed the aptitude for it, to take part in, the routine boundary inspection Cassius conducted there every summer on the Crown's behalf. Rowan had looked, by his own later account, faintly startled by the request, and had asked, not unreasonably, whether 3 days in a working man's company on a state business was truly the kind of outing an 11-year-old boy would enjoy. Cassius's answer, as Rowan repeated it to me long afterward with some amusement, had been characteristically dry. That he did not imagine Torin would enjoy it in the ordinary sense boys enjoy an outing, since it involved a great deal of walking, a certain amount of standing in the rain comparing chain measurements against old survey notes, and almost no diversion whatsoever beyond the work itself. But that he suspected, from what he had observed of the boy over the preceding year, that this was precisely the kind of outing Torin would enjoy more than any other kind he could think to offer him. He was, as it turned out, entirely correct, and I know it because I was there for the whole of it, having been assigned, along with a second guard, to accompany the party. I watched Cassius teach Torin, over those 3 days, the actual working craft of a boundary survey, not the romance of old charters and disputed lines the boy had taught himself out of books and hand-copied charts, but the plain physical labor underneath it. How to hold a surveyor's chain taut against a slope without letting it sag and throw off the measurement. How to read a compass bearing against a landmark and correct for the small daily variance the instrument itself carried. How to set a new marker stone so it would still stand true a century after the men who set it were dust. Cassius was, I discovered, a patient and exacting teacher, more patient by a wide margin than I had ever seen him with anyone else in the household, correcting Torin's grip on the chain 3 times in as many minutes without a trace of impatience, and praising him, plainly and specifically, the first time he set a bearing correctly on his own. "You have the patience for it," Cassius told him on the second evening, the two of them sitting on upturned crates outside the small inspection lodge while the estate's steward saw to supper, Torin's hands still faintly chapped from a full day's work with the chain. "That is the part most men lack, whatever native cleverness they bring to the reading of an old map. The stone does not care how clever you are. It only cares whether you set it exactly where the measurement says to set it, and whether you had the patience to take the measurement 3 times instead of once, to be certain." "Is that why you like it?" Torin asked. "Because it doesn't matter what anyone thinks, just whether the stone is right." I watched Cassius consider the question with a seriousness he rarely extended to anything asked of him in a lighter register, and I have thought since that it was, in its way, the most honest question anyone in that household had put to him in a very long while. "Yes," he said finally, "I believe that is exactly why. A stone set true does not require anyone's good opinion to remain true. It simply is, whether or not a single soul ever notices or thanks the man who set it. I have found, over the years, a great deal of comfort in work like that." He glanced at the boy beside him, and something in his face eased, the way I had come to recognize it easing only in this one particular company. "I do not know that I have ever said that plainly to anyone before you asked." Torin, with the frank tactlessness of the very young, said, "That seems like a lonely way to like something," and then, seeing something shift in the older man's face, added quickly with real concern, "I didn't mean that unkindly." "I know you didn't," Cassius said, "and you are not entirely wrong. It was a lonely way to like something for a great many years." He looked out at the darkening line of the estate boundary, the last of the survey markers just visible in the fading light. "I am finding this week that it is considerably less lonely with a second pair of hands on the chain." I did not repeat that conversation to anyone in the guardroom when we returned to Harrogate, though I carried it with me the way I had carried Reeves' story of the split lip and the fence rail, and the overheard sentence through the study door, folding it into the same steadily growing understanding of the man I had so badly misjudged. Torin came home from those 3 days sunburned, chapped-handed, and happier, by his own quiet account to his mother, than he could remember being on any outing in recent memory, and he began, from that summer onward, to spend a portion of nearly every visit Cassius made to Harrogate at his side, asking after some new point of surveying method or some fresh dispute along one boundary or another, the two of them falling into an easy, companionable rhythm that the rest of the household, slowly and without much comment, simply came to expect. I noticed, over the following year, small things I would once have dismissed entirely. That Cassius had quietly arranged, through the household steward, for Torin to be given standing permission to consult the estate archive whenever he liked, without needing to ask leave each time, a permission no one else in the boy's age had ever been granted, extended without fanfare, and as far as I could tell, without Torin ever being told whose doing it was. That when the Crown surveyors began their preparatory work ahead of that autumn's decennial boundary survey, Cassius had, on his own initiative, sent word to the household tutor suggesting Torin be permitted to observe the survey party's methods firsthand, on the grounds that a future king who understood how his kingdom's edges were actually measured would make fewer costly mistakes about them later. A suggestion the tutor had relayed to Torin's parents as though it had come from the surveyors themselves, and that Torin, delighted, had never once traced back to its true source, because Cassius, true to everything Reeve had told me about him, had asked that his part in it not be mentioned. I learned that last detail only because I overheard it, in passing, in a conversation I was not meant to be party to, outside the small private study Queen Morwenna used for family business, one evening near the end of that summer. I had been posted outside the door, waiting to escort Torin back from an evening lesson, and through the gap where the door had not quite latched, I heard Crown Prince Rowan's voice, warm rather than clipped this time, saying, he asked the tutor not to mention his part in it. I only found out because the surveyor let it slip to me directly, thought I already knew. That does not surprise me in the least, Morwenna said, and there was something in her voice I had not often heard there, a kind of quiet, careful fondness worn thin with years of watching her son from just outside arm's reach. He has spent a great deal of his life believing that the moment credit is given, the kindness stops being safe to have offered. I have told him, more times than either of us could count, that this house does not keep that particular accounting. I am not certain he has ever fully believed me. He seems to be trying, Rowan said, with Torin at least. More than I ever remember him trying with any of the rest of us, at that age. Torin does not know there is meant to be a wall there, Morwenna said, and I heard in the small pause that followed something that might have been the ghost of a smile in her voice, though I could not see her face to be sure of it. That is, I think, a great deal of why it keeps coming down around him, when it has stayed so stubbornly up around everyone who knew to expect it. I did not hear the rest of the conversation, because Torin's lesson ended at that moment and I was needed elsewhere, but I carried those 2 sentences with me for a long while afterward, setting them down beside Reeve's story of the split lip and the fence rail, beside the hour in the archive, beside the flat words in the gallery that had so nearly undone all of it, until the whole uneven shape of the man began, finally, to settle into something I could hold steady without the old crooked edges catching on it every time I turned it over. I understood, by the time the following autumn's boundary survey came due, something I had not understood 2 years before, guarding a boy at a receiving line while a closed door swung shut in front of him. That Lord Cassius's warmth toward Torin was not new, and had never been rare so much as carefully hidden, offered freely wherever he judged the offering safe from an audience that might cost him something to lose, and withheld everywhere he still, after everything, expected to be corrected for showing it. I understood that he had built, around this one boy who loved the same patient, exacting work he had spent his own life quietly devoted to, one of the very few rooms in the whole of Harrowgate where he no longer felt the need to guard himself at all. There was one more small test of that understanding, a handful of months before the boundary survey, that I have come to think of since as a kind of rehearsal for everything that followed, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. It happened on an ordinary spring evening in the East Court, where the household had gathered informally after supper to watch the last light fade over the old ornamental fountain, Torin among them, deep in conversation with Cassius about some fresh dispute along the southern boundary that had reached his attention through the estate archive. Torin, absorbed in making a point, had begun to walk backward along the low stone rim that ran around the fountain's edge, the way children do when their feet have stopped needing their full attention and their whole mind has moved into an argument. And Cassius, without any warning in his voice at all, reached out and closed his hand firmly around the boy's wrist, pulling him a full step forward, off the wet, slick stone and onto dry gravel. In a single motion sharp enough that I saw Torin startle and nearly lose the thread of his own sentence entirely. I felt the old reflex rise in me before I had finished seeing the whole of it, the fast grip, the sudden pull, the boy's surprised half-stumble, and for perhaps half a second, no more, some small, stubborn corner of my mind reached for the old verdict before the rest of me had caught up with the plain evidence in front of it. I want to set that down honestly, because it is the whole point of telling it. The old wariness had not vanished from me simply because I had spent a year correcting it. It had only gone quiet, and it still on occasion tried to speak first. But this time I did not move. I watched instead, and the half-second it took me to watch was enough, because Cassius was already crouching slightly to bring himself level with the boy, one hand still resting, lightly now, on his shoulder rather than gripping his wrist. "The rim is wet where the fountain overspills in the evening," he said, in the same even, unhurried register I had heard him use over a scraped knee and a rabbit's earned trust and 100 smaller kindnesses since. "It looks dry in this light, and it is not. I have watched 2 grown men go down on that exact stretch of stone, in far better boots than yours, and I did not care to add an 11-year-old prince mid-argument to that particular record. Finish your point." "I am still listening." Torin, recovering with his usual quickness, did exactly that, picking the thread of his argument back up without missing more than a breath, and the whole small incident dissolved, within a minute, into nothing more than an ordinary evening's conversation continuing exactly where it had left off. I thought about it a great deal that night, standing my post at the edge of the court long after the family had gone in, turning over how close I had come, in that half-second, to reaching for the old verdict out of nothing more than a fast grip and a startled step, and how differently the whole small moment read once I let myself actually finish watching it before deciding what it meant. I did not know it then, but I have come to believe, looking back, that the East Court taught me something I would need in full only a few months later, at considerably higher cost had I failed to learn it, that a hand closing hard and fast around a boy's arm is not, by itself, evidence of anything at all. It only becomes evidence once you have looked past the speed of it to whatever the speed was answering. What I did not yet understand, walking out to the river meadow on the morning of that year's decennial survey, with Torin's satchel of charts swinging at his side and 4 good years of trust between us making me, I now believe, a little too comfortable in my own certainty of where he would and would not wander, was that the day would test every part of what I had learned, not by asking Cassius to be seen being warm in front of an audience that mattered, the way it had once tested him on a terrace during a different prince's ordeal, but by asking him to be fast and certain and entirely without hesitation in the 3 or 4 seconds that separated Torin from real and immediate harm. The river meadow that morning was already filling by the time we arrived, the long grass beaded with the last of the dew, and the old gray boundary stones standing in their weathered line along the water like a row of patient, half-forgotten sentries. A scatter of pavilion tents had gone up along the meadow's northern edge for the households to shelter under, and the Crown's survey party, a dozen men with their chains and rods and leather-bound record books, had already begun assembling their equipment near the first of the disputed markers, watched over with obvious professional interest by their Rosemont counterparts, who had crossed the river at dawn by the old ford to meet them. Duke Edmund and Duchess Sylvie of Rosemont had come themselves that year, as they did perhaps one survey in 3, greeting Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara, with the easy warmth of 2 households that had settled, over generations, into genuine friendship rather than merely formal alliance. Torin, released from the ordinary demands of a state reception by the informal, practical nature of the day, went almost at once to the edge of the working party to watch the surveyors set up their instruments, his satchel already open, comparing his own hand-copied charts against the fresh measurements being called out and recorded stone by stone along the line. I stayed close, as I always did, near enough to hear every word he said and see every direction he might wander, and I felt, through the whole of that bright, unhurried morning, the particular loose-shouldered ease of a guard whose charge is exactly where he is meant to be, doing exactly what he loves best, with no maze and no crowd of strangers and no genuine hazard anywhere in sight. Lord Cassius arrived a little after mid-morning, having ridden out ahead of the household party to confer with the survey teams before the formal proceedings began, and I watched Torin's whole posture change the moment he spotted him crossing the meadow. Not the careful, watchful stillness he wore for most of the household, but something looser and more eager, the particular unguarded pleasure of a boy greeting someone he has stopped needing to be careful around. Cassius returned the greeting with an easy nod that would have looked, to a stranger, like nothing more than ordinary courtesy, and crouched beside the boy at the 8th marker to examine, with evident genuine interest, a small discrepancy Torin had already noted between the survey party's morning measurement and his own hand-copied chart. "You found an error in a crowned surveyor's own morning work before he's finished his coffee," Cassius said, straightening, something close to open amusement in his voice. "I would suggest you keep that observation to yourself until Master Lassiter has had the chance to check it twice more, or you will make an enemy of the man before lunch." "I already told him," Torin admitted, with the particular guilelessness of a boy who had not yet learned to weigh the political cost of being correct. "He said he'd look at it again after the ceremony." "Of course he did," Cassius said, and there was real warmth in it now, unguarded even with Duke Edmund and half the Rosemont retinue close enough to see it, a fact I noted at the time, only in passing, not yet understanding how far the man had traveled to be able to let it show so plainly in company that mattered. That is precisely what I would have told an 11-year-old who had just corrected my morning's work, and precisely how long it would have taken me to actually go back and check it. Malin and Bram had come out with their parents that morning as well, though neither had much patience for the slow business of boundary stones, and I watched them, from a distance, chase each other in wide looping circles around the base of the old oak near the pavilion tents, while their nurse called after them with more hope than expectation of being heeded. Bram, catching sight of Cassius across the meadow, abandoned the game entirely to run over and demand, with his usual solemn ceremony, whether any of the boundary stones had ever turned out to be a sleeping dragon in disguise, a question Cassius answered with the same grave, considered patience I had once watched him bring to a scraped knee in a lantern-lit hedge maze, before sending the boy back to his sister with a promise to look further into the matter and report his findings. It was, taken all together, as ordinary and contented a morning as any I had spent on that meadow in 4 years of decennial surveys, and I want to set that down plainly, because it is part of why what happened next caught every one of us as unprepared as it did. There was no warning in the weather, no warning in the crowd's mood, no warning at all beyond 2 capable men's stubborn certainty about a single old stone, and a horse that had never once, in a decade of service, given anyone reason to watch it closely. I did not yet know that the day's true trouble was not going to come from Torin at all, but from 2 grown men, on opposite sides of an old and stubborn argument, who were about to raise their voices loudly enough to unsettle a horse standing not 30 feet from where my prince was quietly, happily, and for the first time in 4 years of careful watching, very nearly out of my sight. The trouble began, as it so often does at these old boundary surveys over a single stone. The 11th marker along the line, a weathered gray block that had stood at the river's edge since long before either kingdom had a written charter to argue about, no longer stood quite where the old records said it ought to. The river had shifted its course twice in living memory, cutting a new channel some yards to the south of where the 1680 charter placed it, and the question of whether the marker should be moved to follow the water, or left exactly where 2 centuries of custom had planted it, regardless of where the river now actually ran, was one of those disputes that resurfaced, by long and weary tradition, at nearly every decennial survey, argued over with fresh vigor by whichever officials happened to be standing there that year, and settled in the end by exactly the same uneasy compromise as the last time and the time before that. This year the argument fell to Master Corin Ashby, Eldermoor's crown surveyor general, a precise, thin-shouldered man who had walked this line for nearly 20 years and held the old charter's original placement as something close to sacred text, and to Warden Osgood Fenn, Rosemont's boundary commissioner, a broader, ruddier man newer to his post and considerably less patient with what he plainly regarded as sentimental attachment to a line the river itself had already redrawn. I want to say plainly, because it matters to everything that follows, that neither man ever raised a hand, or threatened to, or said a single word that crossed the line into genuine hostility. This was not a fight, and I do not want to give the impression it was. It was 2 capable, stubborn officials, each entirely certain of his own reading of 2 centuries of surveying records, growing steadily louder and more emphatic in the particular way civil men do, when neither one believes the other is truly listening, their voices carrying further across the open meadow than either of them likely intended, maps and charter transcriptions thrust between them for emphasis. A crowd of onlookers drawn by the rising volume, the way any crowd is drawn to 2 men arguing in public, however dignified the argument's actual substance. The charter says the stone stands at the river's edge, Lassiter was saying, his voice pitched to carry, one finger tapping hard against the leather-bound transcription in Fenn's hands. It does not say *** river's edge, wherever the water happens to have wandered off to in the meantime. Move the marker and you have not corrected the boundary, Warden. You have simply handed Rosemont 4 acres of good grazing that has belonged to Eldermoor since before your grandfather's grandfather drew breath. And I say a boundary that no longer follows the feature it was drawn to follow is not a boundary at all. It is a fiction we are both agreeing to keep telling. Fenn shot back, equally loud, equally certain, drawing himself up to his full, considerable height. You would have us survey a line to a river that has not run there in 40 years, Master Lassiter, out of nothing but stubbornness dressed up as tradition. It is not stubbornness, it is the * charter. It is a piece of paper arguing with a river, and I promise you the river will win that argument a great deal more slowly than it would cost either of our households to simply admit it already has. I had drifted, by this point, some 10 or 12 feet closer to the 2 of them than I had been standing a few minutes before, my attention caught, the way any guard's attention is caught, by raised voices and a gathering crowd, running the ordinary reflexive calculation every guard on that meadow was running at the same moment. Was this simply heat? The kind that burns itself out in argument and nothing more, or was it building toward something a guard needed to step between? I could see, from where I stood, at least 4 other members of the household guard converging on the same slow, careful arc toward the 2 officials, none of us moving fast enough to look as though we distrusted the men's dignity, all of us moving steadily enough to be there within a breath if it turned out we were needed. It was, I want to be honest, exactly the kind of moment that pulls a guard's whole attention toward the loudest thing on the meadow and away from the quiet one. Torin had been standing at the edge of the survey party's working line when the argument began, close enough to the 11th marker that the dispute was, in the most literal sense, happening directly in front of him. Over a piece of history he had spent 2 years of his own free hours studying with a devotion neither Lassiter nor Fenn had any notion of. I do not fault the boy for what happened next, and I want that understood plainly before I set down the rest of it. An 11-year-old fascinated by exactly the subject two grown men were now arguing about, in raised voices, over a genuine and consequential question of boundary law, is not behaving badly by drifting closer to hear it. He was behaving exactly as I would have expected him to behave, which is, I have come to believe, precisely why I did not clock the drift the moment it began. He had edged forward, step by unhurried step, following the argument the way he followed everything that interested him, quietly, attentively, entirely absorbed, his eyes moving between the two officials and the old stone itself, working out, I have no doubt, his own opinion on the question well before either grown man had finished stating his. And in following the argument forward, he had, without once looking behind him, begun edging backward at an angle from where he'd first been standing, working his way around the edge of the gathering crowd toward a clearer line of sight, and directly, though neither of us realized it in time, toward the picket line where the survey party's draft horses stood tethered, waiting out the morning's slow business in the mild, half-drowsing patience horses generally show for work they have done 100 times before. I had my eyes on Lassiter and Fenn. I had a hand near, though not yet on, the strap of my belt, running the same calculation every guard on that meadow was running. I was, for perhaps 40 seconds, not watching Torin at all, and I want to set that down honestly, because it is the plain truth of what happened, and because 4 good years of trust had made me, without my ever quite noticing it happen, a little too certain that a careful boy did not need close watching in a crowd that was, on the whole, entirely civil. The horse that mattered was a big bay gelding named, I would learn afterward, Marsh, the eldest and steadiest of the survey party's 3 draft animals, tethered loosely to a picket line perhaps 15 feet from where the argument had drawn its crowd, cropping at the meadow grass with the placid unconcern of an animal that had hauled survey equipment across half of Eldermoor's boundaries for the better part of a decade. He was not, by any account I have since gathered, a nervous or unpredictable horse. But Fenn, at the height of his exchange with Lassiter, brought his fist down hard on the leather map case he carried, a flat, sharp crack of sound that cut across the meadow at exactly the wrong moment, and Marsh's head came up fast, ears pinned, his weight shifting back and sideways in the sudden startled way even a steady horse will move when a sound it did not expect lands too close and too loud. And Torin, still edging backward, eyes still fixed on the 2 arguing officials, had by then come to stand almost directly within the arc of the animal's hindquarters, close enough that the horse's shifting weight would carry its rear hooves through the exact patch of grass where the boy was standing. I did not see it. I want to be honest about that because it is the center of everything that followed. I was watching Lassiter's raised finger and Fenn's reddening face, gauging whether either man's temper had truly crossed into something a guard needed to stop, and I did not see Torin drift within reach of a startled horse's hindquarters until the moment Lord Cassius's hand closed hard around my prince's arm and hauled him backward, off his feet for an instant, out of the horse's arc entirely. The whole of the meadow, for the length of that one crack of Fenn's fist against the map case, seemed to hold a single collective breath. I heard distantly a woman somewhere in the crowd of onlookers gasp, not yet at anything gone wrong, only at the raised voices themselves, the way a crowd will flinch at any sudden loudness whether or not it understands the cause, and I heard, closer, the particular flat thud of a large animal's hoof shifting hard against turf, a sound I had heard 100 times on 100 ordinary mornings around the Harrogate stables, and had never once, until that moment, heard with my heart already climbing into my throat. I was already turning toward the picket line by instinct alone, the sound registering before my mind had finished assembling what it meant, when the shape of Lord Cassius crossing the last few feet of open grass caught the edge of my vision. It happened very fast, and I want to set down, as precisely as I can, exactly what I saw and exactly what I believed in the space of those 3 or 4 seconds, because the gap between the two is the whole reason I am telling this story at all. I saw Cassius, who had been standing, I would learn afterward, near the picket line the whole while, quietly checking the horse's tack out of the same unshowy attentiveness Reeve had once described to me as the whole of the man's character. Whether anyone was watching him do it or not, move fast. Faster than I had ever seen him move in 4 years of watching him hold himself with such careful stillness, closing the distance to Torin in what could not have been more than 2 long strides. I saw his hand close around the boy's upper arm, hard enough that I saw Torin's whole body jerk with the force of it. I saw him haul the boy backward and half around, off his feet for the length of a single stride, in one continuous motion that looked, from where I stood, 30 feet off, and with my attention already primed by raised voices and a crowd's uneasy murmur, like nothing so much as a grown man seizing a child roughly in the middle of a heated confrontation. For 3 seconds I have counted them many times since, and I do not believe it was longer than that, though it felt, at the time, considerably longer. I believed I was watching Lord Cassius hurt Prince Torin. I do not offer that as an excuse. I offer it as the plain truth of what 4 years of an old, half-buried wariness, however honestly I had worked to correct it, can still do to a guard's first read of a fast and violent-looking motion, especially one that arrives in the middle of 2 grown men shouting over an old grievance, and a crowd already tensed for trouble. Every hard-won year of watching Cassius do quiet, unwitnessed kindness for the boy in my charge did not, in that instant, stop my body from reading a hand closing violently around Torin's arm, as exactly the thing 4 years of careful watching had first trained me to fear from him. I was moving before I had finished having the thought. My hand came up. My weight shifted onto the balls of my feet, already carrying me forward at a pace that would have closed the distance in under 2 seconds, and I do not know, to this day, exactly what I intended to do when I arrived, seize Cassius's wrist, put myself bodily between the 2 of them, shout a command that would have brought every guard on that meadow converging at a dead run. Only that I was 3 strides into doing one of those things before the rest of what I was looking at finally caught up with me. It caught up with me the instant Marsh's hindquarters swung through the exact space Torin had been standing a heartbeat before, one heavy hoof coming down hard enough into the turf to tear a divot the length of my forearm, precisely where a small boy's foot had been planted a single second earlier. I stopped where I was. My hand, still half raised, dropped on its own, the whole shape of what I had just watched rearranging itself in the space of a single breath. Not a man seizing a boy in anger, but a man reaching a boy exactly 1 second before a half-ton animal's startled weight would have crushed whatever stood in its arc, closing the distance too fast and too hard for gentleness to have been any part of what the moment allowed, because gentleness costs time, and time was the one thing neither of them had. Cassius had already turned Torin fully behind him by then, one arm still locked around the boy's shoulders, his own body angled between Torin and the still startled horse, his voice pitched low, and even in a way that reached me clearly even across the settling commotion of the meadow. "Easy," he was saying to the horse, I understood after a beat, not to Torin, in the same low, unhurried register I imagined a man might use gentling any frightened animal he had spent years around, and then, to the boy himself, quieter still, "You are all right. You are entirely all right. Look at me good. Are you hurt anywhere, truthfully now?" Torin, white-faced, breathing hard, shook his head, his eyes wide and fixed on the horse rather than on the man who had just hauled him bodily out of its path. He started and stopped and swallowed and tried again. I didn't even see it. I wasn't even looking at it. "No," Cassius agreed, still holding him, still angled protectively between the boy and the animal, though the groom had already reached Marsh's head by then, and was murmuring him back to stillness with the same low, patient competence I had just watched Cassius use a moment before. You were listening to the argument, which was, I will grant you, considerably more interesting than a horse's temper on an ordinary morning. That is not a fault in you, Torin. It is simply the plain arithmetic of standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. And it is precisely the arithmetic every guard in this household spends his working life trying to keep between a person and a hazard he has not yet noticed. I had reached them by then, my own breath coming hard, my hands. I noticed this only afterward, with a kind of distant embarrassment still faintly unsteady from the aborted motion of a half-second before. My lord, I managed, and it came out rough, and I had to stop and start again. Your Highness. Are you? He is unhurt, Cassius said, before Torin could answer for himself, though he said it without any of the flat-closed courtesy I had once catalogued so carefully in my private ledger, only a plain, urgent honesty that had clearly not yet finished settling in his own chest either. Unhurt, and considerably luckier in his footing than the grass beneath it. He loosened his grip on Torin's shoulders by careful degrees, the way I imagine a man loosens his hold on anything he has just been gripping harder than he meant to, checking, visibly, that the boy could stand steadily on his own before letting go entirely. I am sorry for the arm, Torin. I did not have time to be gentle about it, and I am aware that I very likely bruised you in the taking. I would do the same again without a moment's hesitation, and I hope, in a day or two, once it has stopped smarting, you will agree it was the better bargain. Torin, recovering with the particular swift resilience of the young once the worst has genuinely and visibly passed, looked down at his own arm, already reddening faintly where 4 strong fingers had closed around it, and then up at Cassius, and managed something that was very nearly, though not quite, a laugh. You moved really fast, he said, with the frank astonishment of a boy discovering something new about a man he thought he already understood. I didn't know you could move like that. Neither until roughly 10 seconds ago did I, Cassius said, and something in his own voice, I was close enough, finally, to hear it plainly, was not entirely steady either. Lassiter and Fenn, I should say, had gone utterly silent the instant Marsh startled, their argument forgotten entirely, both men white and stricken, converging on the small knot of us at the picket line with a speed that suggested each believed, with genuine and considerable horror, that his own raised voice had very nearly cost a Prince of Eldermoor his life. It had, in the plainest sense, done exactly that. Fenn's flat hand against the map case had startled the horse, and neither man could pretend otherwise. And I watched the whole heat of their argument about a stone and a shifted river drain out of both of them in the space of a single held breath, replaced by something considerably more sober. Your Highness, Fenn said, and I have rarely heard a man's voice carry so much genuine wretchedness in 3 words. I cannot tell you how deeply. It was an accident, Warden Fenn, Torin said, with a composure that struck me, even in the middle of everything, as remarkable in a boy who had very nearly been badly hurt not 2 minutes before. Marsh isn't a nervous horse. You didn't mean it. I wasn't watching where I was standing, and Lord Cassius says that's the whole of what happened, and I believe him, because he was the one close enough to actually see it. It was, I thought, watching the boy say it, exactly the kind of measured, generous accounting his own father might have offered in the same circumstance. And I felt, not for the first time that year, a quiet pride in the boy I had spent 4 years guarding that had nothing at all to do with my own part in keeping him safe. Queen Morwenna reached us within the minute, having crossed most of the meadow at a pace considerably faster than royal dignity generally allowed itself in public, her face gone the particular careful white of a mother arriving at the tail end of a fright rather than its center. She took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. The horse, now settled, the torn divot in the turf, her son's arm still loosely encircling Torin's shoulders, the boy himself pale but plainly whole, and I watched something in her shoulders come down slowly, From a height I had not fully registered them reaching until they descended from it. "What happened?" she said, and it was not quite a question, addressed to all of us and to none of us in particular. "Marsh startled," Cassius said, before anyone else could answer, and Torin was standing in his ark, listening rather too closely to Master Lassiter and Warden Fenn's discussion of the 11th marker to notice. I was near enough to reach him first. "He is unhurt." A brief pause, and then, with a plainness I do not believe I had ever once heard him offer his mother in 4 years of watching the two of them together, "I frightened him a good deal more than the horse managed to, hauling him back the way I did. I would ask that you not scold him for the drift. It was mine to have noticed sooner, standing where I was." Morwenna looked at her son for a long moment, not at Torin, though her eyes went to him too, briefly, with evident and immediate relief, but at Cassius, at the still faint unsteadiness in his hands, at the way he had not, even now, fully released his hold on the boy's shoulder, and something in her own face did the same slow, unguarded thing I had watched it do once before, months earlier, through a half-closed study door. When she had spoken to Rowan about a wall, her son kept building and rebuilding around himself, out of 13 years of learning that softness costs something. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said quietly to Cassius alone, though I stood close enough to hear every word of it. "You reached him. That is the whole of what matters this morning, and I imagine it will go on being the whole of what matters to me for a great many mornings after this one." Duke Edmund and Duchess Sylvie arrived close on Morwenna's heels, along with Crown Prince Rowan, moving at nearly a run once word of the commotion had reached the pavilion tents, and there followed a quarter hour of the kind of relieved, overlapping conversation that always follows a fright safely past. Torin's arm, examined by the household physician who had traveled with the party, pronounced bruised but otherwise entirely sound. Fenn and Lassiter each separately, and at length expressing a mortification neither man seemed able to fully talk himself out of, Duke Edmund clasping Cassius's shoulder with a warmth that struck me. Watching it, as the kind of gesture a household extends only to a man it has genuinely come to trust rather than merely tolerate. I stood a little apart from the center of it, as a guard properly should, and it was there, once the worst of the commotion had settled into ordinary relieved murmuring, that Cassius found a moment to look over at me directly, and did not look away. "Sergeant Ashby," he said. "My lord," I said, and felt, saying it, the full weight of the 3 seconds I had spent with my hand half raised against him settle into my chest all at once, considerably heavier than I had expected it to. "I saw your hand come up," he said quietly, not unkindly, before I could find the words to raise it myself. "I do not fault you for it." I imagine, from 30 feet off, in the middle of 2 men shouting over a boundary stone, it looked very much like I had seized him in anger rather than pulled him clear of a horse's hindquarters. I would rather have a guard who moves first and sorts the truth of it a half-second later, where Torin's safety is concerned, than one who hesitates to be certain first. That instinct is not a fault in you, Sergeant. It is very nearly the whole of your post. "I should have seen the horse before you did," I said. "I should have seen him drifting before either of us needed to move at all. I was watching Lassiter and Fenn, and I let 4 good years of trusting him make me slower than I had any right to be." "You were watching the loud thing on the meadow," Cassius said, "which is, I imagine, precisely what every guard on this field was watching in that moment, and precisely why I happened to be the one standing near the quiet one instead. I do not think there is any shame in that arithmetic, Sergeant. I think it is simply what happens when an argument draws every eye in one direction and leaves a boy free to wander unwatched in the other, and I would rather we both learn from it than either of us carry it as a fault we did not, in the end, actually commit." I looked at him a long moment and found, for the first time in 4 years, that I had nothing guarded left to say to him, only the plain truth of it. "I misjudged you for a long while, my lord, longer than I'm proud of. I want you to know I don't any longer, and I haven't for some time, and that whatever I believed I was seeing 30 feet off just now, it wasn't a fair reading of the man I've actually come to know these past 2 years. It was an old habit catching up with me faster than the truth could. Something crossed Cassius's face at that, not quite a smile, but close to the ghost of one, the same expression I had first glimpsed across an archive table over an old parish chart. "Old habits are stubborn things, Sergeant," he said. "I have one or two of my own I am still working to unlearn, and I do not imagine either of us will finish the work in a single season. But I would rather stand beside a guard who catches himself within 3 seconds and says so plainly than one who never had the honesty to notice the mistake at all." He glanced down at Torin, who had drifted back to his side the moment the physician had finished with his arm, already asking Lassiter, with his usual unstoppable curiosity, whether the 11th marker's placement had ever actually been settled, or whether it simply got argued over freshly every 10 years by long custom. "I believe your prince has already moved on to the next question. I would suggest we do the same." The 11th marker's dispute, as it happened, was settled within the hour. In the plain and practical manner, such things are generally settled once the 2 men arguing over it have been given a sharp reminder that a grievance over 4 acres of grazing is worth considerably less than the fright they had both just had. Lassiter and Fenn agreed, with a speed that suggested neither much wanted to prolong the discussion, to a modest compromise neither side had proposed before that morning: the marker to remain at its old charter position for purposes of record, with a formal notation added to both households' charts acknowledging the river's shifted course, a solution so obviously sensible that both men privately wondered aloud, within my hearing, why it had taken 2 centuries and a startled horse to arrive at it. The household did not return to Harrogate until late that afternoon. The formal proceedings concluded with rather less ceremony and considerably more relief than the day had begun with, and I stood my post outside the small family dining room that evening while King Alaric, informed of the whole affair well before supper, insisted on hearing the account told properly, in full, from everyone who had been close enough to see it. I was not present in the room for the telling, being occupied outside its door with the ordinary business of a guard's evening rotation, but I heard a good deal of it through the same imperfect channel by which a guard learns most things he is not officially meant to overhear. And what I heard that evening was not the sober retelling of a near tragedy so much as the particular warm, half-laughing relief of a family that has already confirmed, several times over, that everyone at the table is safe, and can now afford to marvel at how close the danger came, without the marveling costing anyone their composure. Bram, predictably, wanted to know whether Marsh had been startled by a dragon nobody else had noticed, a theory Torin dismantled with patient, brotherly thoroughness, and Malin demanded, with the particular fierce loyalty of a younger sister, a full accounting of exactly how fast Lord Cassius had moved, expressing, upon hearing the answer, a degree of admiration that made Torin laugh outright for what I gathered was the first time since the meadow. King Alaric, I am told, asked Cassius directly, in front of the whole table, whether he had given any thought at all to his own footing crossing that distance at speed, on uneven ground, in riding boots not built for a sprint. And Cassius had answered, with the dry honesty I had come to expect of him, that he had given it no thought whatsoever, and did not believe he would give it any more thought were the circumstance to arise again tomorrow. "That is precisely the answer I hoped to hear," Alaric had said, according to Rowan, who repeated the exchange to me some days later with evident satisfaction, and precisely the answer I would expect from any man I trusted enough to leave a grandson in his company unsupervised. "I find I have been slower than I ought to have been myself, in extending you that trust plainly, Cassius. I do not intend to remain slow about it any longer." I heard Torin's own voice once, clear through the door in a lull between the louder conversation around him, telling his grandfather, with the particular careful precision he brought to everything he considered important, that he did not want anyone to think Lord Cassius had done anything except exactly the right thing, as fast as it needed doing, and that he, Torin, intended to be considerably more careful about where he stood at future surveys. Though he hoped that would not mean he could no longer attend them, because he had already found 2 more errors in the Eastern chart that he intended to raise with Master Lassiter before the season was out. I smiled at that, alone in the corridor, in a way I do not often permit myself to smile while standing post, because it was such a plain, complete return to the boy I had guarded for 4 good years, undiminished by the fright, already turning his attention back toward the work he loved, carrying the whole frightening morning lightly enough that it would not, I felt certain even then, leave any lasting shadow on him. Later that evening, once the family had dispersed, and the household had begun settling into its ordinary night quiet, I passed Lord Cassius once more in the long gallery, the same gallery where he had once brushed past Torin and me with a flat, closed answer that had so nearly undone 2 years of hard-won understanding. He was alone this time, no ledger under his arm, standing for a moment at the tall window that looked out over the darkening grounds toward the river, and he did not startle when I passed, though I made no particular effort at quiet. "Sergeant," he said without turning. "My lord," I said and paused, uncertain whether he wished company or simply acknowledgement. "I keep returning to the sound the hoof made in the turf," he said quietly, still facing the window. "I imagine I will keep returning to it for some while yet. It is a strange thing to have moved fast enough that the worst outcome never had the chance to happen, and to feel afterward as shaken as if it had." He turned, finally, and looked at me directly, and there was none of the old guarded distance in it. "I do not believe I properly thanked you this morning for how quickly you set aside what you believed you were seeing. It would have cost me a great deal more than a torn coat once to be misjudged in front of half 2 kingdoms worth of nobility. I find I minded it a good deal less than I once would have, knowing how quickly you corrected the account. You gave me very little time to go on misjudging you, my lord," I said. 2 years of watching you closely does that eventually to a man's first instinct, whatever the old habit still wants to believe. "Eventually," Cassius agreed, "is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. But I will take it, Sergeant, and gladly." He looked back out toward the river, dark now beneath the rising evening stars, the boundary meadow somewhere beyond it, quiet again, its argument settled, its stones standing exactly where 2 centuries of stubborn custom had always kept them. "Good night, Sergeant Ashby." "Good night, my lord," I said, and continued down the gallery and did not look back, and found, walking, that I did not need to. I think of that morning often now, a good while on from it, and I have come to believe it taught me something I might otherwise never have learned cleanly, in 4 years of guarding a careful, quiet boy who rarely gave me cause to doubt my own instincts. A guard's first read of a fast and frightening motion is not always a fair one, however honestly he has worked to correct the habits that shaped it, and the measure of the man is not whether the old wariness rises in him at all. I do not believe it ever fully stops rising, not in anyone who has once had good reason to feel it, but how quickly he lets the truth in front of him overtake it, and how honestly he says so once it has. I did not have to wait long after that morning to see how thoroughly the household's own opinion of Lord Cassius had begun to shift, though it did not happen all at once, in the way of most things worth trusting. Word of the boundary meadow traveled the way word travels through a household like ours, guardroom to kitchen to nursery and back again, gathering warmth rather than color in the telling, until it had settled into its own small permanent place in Harrowgate's memory. The morning Lord Cassius crossed a meadow faster than anyone had ever seen him move, and hauled a prince clear of a startled horse's hooves with a second to spare, and not a moment more. Petrie, who had laughed into his cup the first time I told the archive story half-heartedly over cards, did not laugh at all when the boundary meadow account reached the guardroom, and had the grace, a few weeks later, to admit as much to me directly. "I take back what I said about him being decent only when it costs him nothing," he told me. Crossing that meadow at a dead run in front of 2 dukes and a full survey party costs a man a great deal, Ashby, however plain he tries to make it sound after. I don't imagine I'd have managed it half so cleanly myself. Reeve, for his part, said very little about it at all, which was, from Reeve, its own kind of statement, though he did look at me over the rim of his cup, with something that might, on a less carefully composed man, have passed for satisfaction, and said only, "Told you," before returning to his mending. As for Torin, the bruise on his arm faded within the week, and he carries, as far as I can tell, no lasting fear of horses, or of raised voices, or of boundary meadows in general. He was back at the archive within days, and has since added a careful, entirely factual account of the 11th marker's final settlement to his own collection of hand-copied charts, footnoted, at his own insistence, with a brief and admiring note on the exact placement of Marsh's picket line that morning, which he still finds, a full season later, quietly and enormously funny. He asks Lord Cassius most weeks some new question about an old survey or a disputed stone, and Cassius, without fail, sits with him for however long the question requires, in the archive or at the stable rail or, once or twice now, at the family table itself, in plain view of whoever happens to be dining, with no closed door in sight. I am still posted to Prince Torin, most days, and I no longer watch Lord Cassius the way I once did, filing his every silence and every kindness into a private ledger weighted against him before he had ever earned the weighing. I watch him now the way I watch any man I have come, honestly and at real cost to my own pride, to trust, not without care, because a guard's care does not simply switch itself off, but without the old suspicion standing behind it, waiting for evidence to confirm what I had already decided. I think most often of the 3 seconds in that meadow when I had my hand half raised against a man who had done nothing in that moment, but exactly what a devoted guardian does for a boy he has come, quietly and without any audience's permission, to love. I have come to believe that readiness to act is not worth very much on its own, unless a man is also willing to look honestly, and quickly, at what he actually finds once he arrives, to let the truth rearrange what he was so certain he already knew, rather than defend a wrong first read simply because it came to him fastest. I very nearly did not look quickly enough. I am glad, every week I watch Torin lay some new chart across the archive table for Lord Cassius's unhurried, genuine attention, that in the end I did. That is the whole of what happened at the river meadow, as I saw it, standing closer than nearly anyone else in this household to the man I misjudged and the boy he saved. I set it down now because I think it deserves to be remembered plainly, without the old ledger's crooked edges left in it, not the story of a dangerous man restrained just in time, but of a devoted one, moving faster than any of us, toward exactly the danger the rest of us had missed.